Back in the 1960s in the UK, a psychiatrist by the name of Arthur Gurdham put forward this idea that some chronic illnesses might be due to the phenomenon of too much self. So this was quite a radical departure from the mainstream of medical thinking, obviously. And Arthur Gurdham was going beyond the bounds of psychiatry in this as well. He wasn't specifically referring to mental health, but more to conditions that have tended to be in the increase in recent years, such as heart disease and arthritis and diabetes, a number of other conditions. Now, undoubtedly, the increase that we're still seeing in a whole range of chronic health conditions is due to lifestyle and diet and factors such as that, societal factors really, because it's societal factors that decide our lifestyle. We don't decide it, generally speaking. But what Arthur was saying was that there was something way more important, and that is something that we always miss, and that is the fact that there's too much self. It's like a hypertrophy of the self. It's developed too much. It's taken up too much space. Arthur Gurdham was not just a psychiatrist, but a consultant psychiatrist who was involved in the expert panel, which was responsible for planning and setting up the NHS. So he should have been a person that you'd imagine would have got listened to some extent. Most of us coming out with an idea like this would, of course, be roundly ignored. But you'd think someone of his standing would be able to get the idea aired. But nobody took a blinded notice. I mean, nobody took the slightest bit of notice of what he had to say, and the idea was never surfaced again, as far as I know. But the curious thing about this is that 70 years on, we are now seeing from the field of neurology and neuropsychiatry evidence to back up what Arthur Gurdham was saying, which is very often the way with scientists when they come up with ideas that are ahead of their time. It can take 100 years or more for the world to catch up with them. We're awfully conservative in our thinking, and we hate to be put off our track, even when our track is not really getting us anywhere. We still hate to be put off our track. So the discoveries that are coming out, essentially due to the advances in brain scanning technology, show that there's a set of loci, a set of locations in the brain that are associated with anxiety and reactivity and neurotic mental ill health, really. And this collection of locations has been dubbed the me center for obvious reasons. So the more active this me center is in our brains, the more we personalize and super personalize everything that's happening to us and bring our own history into everything that's happening to us. And as a result, things that really have nothing to do with us trigger us. They kind of stab at us in our sore points and reactivate old dramas that we have going on in our heads. So what that basically means is we never really escape from these old dramas, as any psychotherapist would tell you. We just continually relive them and interpret everything that's going on just to fuel that particular fire. And of course, there's not even any benefit to come from that, since the old dramas were sources of distress for us, and what we're really doing is keeping ourselves feeling bad. And so the me center narrows our horizon hugely. It narrows our horizon to the point that everything is about me. And that could be in a good way. We could get excited. But more often than not, we just get triggered and we get reactive. And we have a bad time. So neurosis is definitely about having a bad time, not having a good time. Even when we think we're having a good time, we're really having a bad time, as we'll find out later on. So this is interesting because it brings us right back to what Arthur Gurdon was saying all that time ago. Even though, as far as I know, Arthur Gurdon didn't specifically mention the connection with mental health conditions. Now, there are a lot of traditions in the world which have said exactly this. The first one that comes to mind is Buddhism. That's essentially that whole message of Buddhism right there. I don't know who said it, but there's someone who said the little Buddhist slogan, no self, no problem. Of course, when we hear that, we might naturally start thinking in terms of all sorts of fancy ideas of enlightenment and nirvana, the state of no self. But we don't need to think about it. There's no point in us getting excited at prospects like that. If we do get excited about it, it's only our me center getting excited anyway, so it kind of defeats the object. But what we can realistically and practically do is reduce the me center, reduce the activity going on in the me center, and use other parts of our brain and use other parts of our of our being that are not so exclusively concerned with the propagation and the maintenance of the self-construct or the I concept. So it's, in general, it's kind of like saying no self, no problem, but we're not trying to eliminate the self, but maybe bring it down to more reasonable proportions. So we can think of the term in terms of the self as being terribly inflamed, a big nasty inflammation that's very, very tender and very, very sore, like an appendix maybe. We can't cure it with an operation. So although the neurobiology is interesting, it's not really necessary to go down that road too much or to swat up on all the details. All it does really is help us to take this approach more seriously. Knowing the anatomy is not going to help us shrinking the self really, but it does help us to realize that this is a thing and to focus our attention on it. In other words, it's not possible to have an operation and get rid of the me center. I imagine we'd like to be able to do that. With our fix-it approach to mental health, the idea of just doing a thing to make ourselves better, like that has huge appeal. Like the idea that we can put some kind of microchip in the brain to stop the part of our brain that gets overactive in OCD and cure OCD with an implant. I don't think that's been mooted as an idea, but I don't think it's got very far. But the point is, everything like that is just essentially it's the magic wand syndrome, and we can shrink the me center, but the way of doing that is a very old-fashioned way. People have practiced that way for thousands upon thousands of years, and it's a slow and it's a difficult way, and there is no quick fix for it. Much as we love the quick fix or the shortcut, we can't shortcut this one, for the simple reason that if we do, as I already said, if we do want to shortcut it, we can be sure of one thing, that it is the me center that is interested in the shortcut, because it hopes to benefit, which is perverse and bizarre. How can the me center benefit from shrinking the me center? Because it won't at all. But that's how we think. So it's possible to, leaving the neuropsychiatry aside for a moment, which is great because it does vindicate Arthur Gurdon when he says that a lot of sickness is caused by too much self. But we can go back to an earlier current of human thinking, which is Taoism. And Taoism, in this regard, says exactly the same thing. Taoism celebrates the spontaneous side of human nature, which is fascinating and which brings us back to ourselves and back to nature. Whereas in the Western world, we celebrate the purposeful or directed side of our nature, which can give some short-term benefits and can give us a short-term feeling of agency and empowerment with regard to the self-concept or the me center, but which gets us in trouble because it alienates us from, not only alienates us from nature, it alienates us from our own nature, which of course is the same as nature. It's all the one nature, or it's all the Tao, as a Taoist would say. So when we're talking about the me center, we could also talk about the idea that we have of the controller, who has responsibility for controlling everything or directing everything. And so we can call that the purposeful self. So in the West, there is no doubt at all that we have celebrated the purposeful self endlessly. We're having a love affair with it. Spontaneity is kind of all but meaningless to us, even though we kind of pay lip service to it and say, isn't it great to be spontaneous? It's all but meaningless to us in practical terms. We have developed another side of ourselves, which is the self-conscious side, the side that calculates everything and does everything else, does everything that it does deliberately and purposefully. So that has got hugely overdeveloped at the expense of the spontaneous. And doing this brings trouble upon our heads. It has brought trouble upon our heads in the form of neurosis, because when you take away all the spontaneity from life, life becomes a dreadful chore. And not only does it become a dreadful chore, it becomes a dreadful, meaningless chore. And so do we really want to make life into a dreadful, meaningless chore? And of course we don't. If we knew what we were doing, we would absolutely have nothing to do with it. But we don't know what we're doing, and we're heading down that road full pelt. So we can just use the specific example of anxiety just to explain how over-investing in the purposeful self, which actually means seeing ourselves as being the purposeful self and nothing else, really constricting our field of awareness till that's the only aspect of ourselves that we know. So we're cutting off actually everything else, and we're becoming this little tight, little purposeful self that has to do everything on purpose. And if it doesn't do anything on purpose, nothing's going to happen. So it's easy enough to see that when we identify with the purposeful self, we're heading towards a situation where we can very easily become anxious about life. And the reason we become anxious about life is because we are seeing life as something we ourselves have to take charge of, something we have to do. We've given ourselves a job, and the job is to live life in the right way, or make a good job of it, or do it properly. And the language that we use, such as being a winner versus being a loser, illustrates this perfectly. Being a winner means we've lived life right and we get all the accolades. We've cracked the problem, which is life. We've solved the problem. Or we've played the game of life well, and we get to be winners at it. And then there is the fear that goes with this, that is the fear that we won't get it right, or we'll fail at it, then we become losers, of course. And this way of thinking really is deep down in us, the idea that we can succeed at life or fail at life. What that really means is that we can succeed or fail at the ludicrously pointless games that we invent, the societal games, which have nothing to do with life at all. And the thing about anxiety is that when we're anxious, we're actually a bit more aware than people who aren't anxious, because we're starting to be aware that this task that we've given ourselves, the task of living life, of solving the problem that is life, of controlling everything basically, is too difficult for us. And not only that it's too difficult for us, it's impossible for us. It's an impossibility, it's too big. We're never going to be able to do it. So we've got locked into this position of thinking we have to control successfully, and yet the awareness is starting to dawn that is a supreme impossibility. It's just too big for us. It's a task. It's an impossible task. But because we're locked into the task, or the supposed task, we can't just give it up as a bad job and laugh and say, this is a joke. What the hell am I doing? Because we are absolutely convinced that we have to do it, otherwise the alternative is very, very bad. We don't even know why it's so bad. We just know that it is the ultimate in catastrophes. So it's gone beyond winning and losing in societal games. This is winning and losing in the existential game. Only there is no existential game, but we've made existence into a game which we can win at or lose at, which is a very bad idea to do that, because no matter how clever or resourceful or determined we are, if we make a game out of life, we can never win at it, for the simple reason that we've put ourselves in a position where we have to keep on controlling and controlling. And the more we control something, the more we need to control it, the more it fights back, the more it depends upon our control. So we're locked into this dreadful situation of having to control the whole time. And what we're controlling isn't really life. We've missed life. We're now controlling our game of life, which for us is life. So that's clearly not a great situation to be in. And all of our therapeutic approaches to anxiety and other mental health conditions completely fail to understand this. us coming from the point of view that we do come from, which is that everything is about the purposeful self and empowering the purposeful self so it can be purposeful more effectively without realizing we're exacerbating the heart of the problem. So there's an inflammation of the purposeful self and we're just making it more and more inflamed, and we're taking on too much responsibility for ourselves and for life, and we're taking on even more responsibility. So when we hear these kind of phrases such as managing negative emotions or managing anxiety, what that really means is that a purposeful self has been given another job. We're in the position of managing, which means that it is our responsibility, which means that it means that life doesn't happen by itself, and the psyche isn't spontaneous. It means that the psyche has to be controlled and managed by us, and that life itself, in essence, since we can't separate the psyche from life, has to be managed. And that managing makes us identify even more, makes the me center swell up and get even bigger. Now, as I started off by saying, the thing to do clearly is to shrink the me center, not to exacerbate it, not to put it on a pedestal any more than it already is. And we can shrink the me center by being aware of the truth that life happens by itself, and that the psyche, as part of life, also happens by itself. And so there's no need for us to think about correcting things or doing things or taking responsibility for it. If we can genuinely have this insight, it's a tremendous weight off our shoulders. And so what we're talking about here really is, it begins and ends with the insight, because obviously there's nothing to do, since the only doer is the I concept. And what we actually see when we do gain insight into this key property of life, the key property which is that life does itself, all by itself, no need for supervision, is that we see that the purposeful self itself is a spontaneous production of the spontaneous play of life. So even though the purposeful self likes to think it's the boss and take credit for any good stuff that happens, and also take the blame for any mistakes that it might make or any bad stuff that happens, we get this perception that even the purposeful self just happens. So when I have an idea that I want to do something, or when I have a goal, that goal itself is a spontaneous thing. The goal just happens. And absolutely everything that goes on in our heads just happens. We don't have to stand behind it and make it happen. So when we see this, we also see that life isn't a task. There's no need to worry about it not happening in the correct way. There's no need to worry about not being able to manage it, despite what all the therapists tell us about the necessity to manage our emotions and dampen down our reactivity and do this and do that. There's absolutely no need for any of that at all. All that's needed is the insight that life isn't a task, Or that, as we could also say that life isn't a problem we have to solve. Okay, thanks for watching.